Welcome to Tucker Carlson Today. Eric Metaxas is probably one of the deepest and best-selling Christian authors, maybe just authors, in the United States. He's a nationally syndicated radio host. He's written, I don't know how many books, probably over 20. He's got a new one out called Is Atheism Dead? He's the author of two books that I have read personally and loved, biographies of Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, and an amazing biography, the best biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was murdered in Flossenburg prison in 1945. Eric Metaxas is a really smart, deep guy and a serious Christian. He joins us now.
If I have fooled you, I've got it made.
So
if I've just also, do you also think I'm authentic? Because I want to fool you into thinking I'm authentic, a truth teller.
I don't know. We'll find out.
Yeah.
So I have a million questions to ask you. I want to ask you about your life. I, of course, want to ask you about your book, Is Atheism Dead? Rooting for that, of course. But first, it's because it's just on me. I have to ask you about the moment that we're living in. I stayed up very late last night reading an account of the Russian Revolution from the perspective of the White Army, which I had actually never read, despite reading a lot about it. And I was really struck by what was in the air in 1917 in Moscow and St. Petersburg, this atheist movement unleashing these forces of violence and chaos for its own sake. And some of it, I have to say, was recognizable in a disturbing way. So, speaking as a Christian who doesn't know much about theology, is not very interested, I can still feel that it feels like there's a spiritual component to what is going on. You're deeply grounded in this. I throw it to you. Is there?
My take on where we are now. The book that you mentioned, Is Atheism Dead? When I started to write that book, I wasn't thinking about where we would be today.
Yeah.
But it's kind of funny because God plans these things, right? I am just astonished at how bad things are, right? We don't have time to get into it.
Right.
But anybody who
I do a very depressing show on this every night.
I know you do. And by the way, I can't watch your show too much just because I agree with you so violently that it's like I can't take it. It's like I just
know
agree
what you
mean. But but I guess the point is that when things are this crazy, you know and I know that anybody with a modicum of sanity and common sense also sees that things are crazy.
Yeah.
And they are all asking the same question, and you're asking it implicitly, and I talk about it. What is happening? What is happening? And the reason you say what is happening is because you're saying, I've seen crazy stuff, but I've never seen anything on this level. It doesn't seem... I can't account for it.
That's it.
This isn't mere incompetence, right?
I can't account for it.
In other words, if we had a president or a fake president who's just a total idiot, he wouldn't be able to push forward this level of chaos and insanity. So it can't just be incompetence. What is it? Is there a handful of billionaire, Kabbalists who are leading? What is happening? But most people know clearly this is unprecedented. Anybody who's been alive in America, 1968 and the madness of that doesn't quite compare to this. So people are saying, what is going on? And at the bottom of it, and this is what I was saying when I wrote the book, I wasn't thinking about this, but at the bottom of it, ultimately, the book starts with a quote from Solzhenitsyn's famous quote. He said, when the horrors were unleashed by the Bolsheviks, old Russian people said that all these things that are happening now, how did they happen? They've happened because man has forgotten God. In other words, if you have to go someplace to like the root answer, is that something has happened.
And there was, I should say, spiritual corruption at the heart of the Russian royal family with Rasputin and Nicholas and Alexandra.
I didn't think we'd be talking about Rasputin, man.
But no. We don't need to get into it.
So
but
funny.
Like there was from the very beginning a spiritual component to what happened in Russia.
Well, but just to keep it simple, right? The devil can use the church. He can use atheists. The point is that he doesn't care. He'll take what's available. And right now in America, in the West, I think there are people looking around saying the level of madness is so unprecedented and it's happening so fast. What's behind this? That's what they're asking.
Well, exactly.
Right. And so the short answer, I would say, is that there's kind of how do we put this? Whenever, and again, when I wrote the book Is Atheism Dead, I wasn't thinking about atheism, but in the course of writing it and the course of now releasing it and talking about it, you realize that at the end of the day, there are two worldviews. If you're an American, you get this better than anybody. One is that there's a God who loves us, who wants us to be free, who wants us to govern ourselves, to have the most limited government, the most freedom. And you need God and you need virtue. You can't force virtue, so there's the conundrum at the heart of American self-government. But that's the best system for quote-unquote human flourishing. And at the other end of the spectrum, the most government power, whether it's Marxism of any kind, whether it's the CCP today or whether it's the Nazis or whatever, or whether it's North Korea, the only thing that threatens their power and their ability to crush people and treat them as slaves is people who believe in something beyond the state.
Exactly.
So if you believe in
human power.
Right. So if you believe in God, you are a horrifying threat to anybody with that kind of Marxist big state view who simply wants power. And in our lifetimes, we've never seen the battle lines drawn this way. There's always been kind of this, people kind of playing patty cake with big statism or whatever. It's never been so dramatic as it is right now. But right now you have an absolutely astonishing, unprecedented division between people who are willing to sell their souls for power, on the one hand, and then the people over here who are saying, this isn't right, this doesn't seem like it's going in the right direction, what is causing it? And so I didn't expect atheism really to be something I was talking about with regard to politics at all. But it's so funny to me because we've never seen a Democratic Party we know that has tacked so hard left that it's flirting with Marxism and socialism. We've never seen that. But we've also never seen the connection between when you push God out, you get atheist Marxism. Like you're going to have some kind of slavery in this modern day, or you're going to have some kind of freedom. And we have seen kind of history give us a moment where the lines are just, we've simply never seen anything as draconian, as crazy. So I think most people are asking the question that you asked at the beginning, is what is going on? And I think a lot of people can feel that there's a spiritual component. They just don't know quite where to go with that.
Well, that's where I am, because there's no other way. And I have to say, we have a guest often on called Jason Whitlock, who kind of says exactly what he thinks all the time. He's like the last American who does that. And he's the one who awakened me to the possibility that maybe this isn't explainable in purely political terms. I'm so used to thinking everything in temporal terms, and they want power, it's about the next election.
Yeah.
But then you see stuff that's so irrational, that's so destructive for its own sake, self-destructive even, then you're like, there's no explanation for that.
Well, right, and that's where you come up with the word evil. Could it be evil? Is there a thing that's worse than stupidity and incompetence and just bad ideas? Is there something behind it? It's kind of funny. There's a book, one of the books that really helped me find faith. It was, I guess I was 24. I graduated Yale, and I drank enough of the Kool-Aid to have drifted off into a kind of, tell me what I need to believe to succeed. Like I didn't know what I believed. I just knew that the conservatives and the Christians, they're bad, and so I don't want to. This was in the 80s already, right? But I remember during that year of twisting in the wind, trying to figure out the meaning of life, I got a copy of M. Scott Peck's book, People of the Lie. Now, he was a Harvard psychiatrist.
I remember it really well. I read the book.
Very famous for his book, The Road Less Traveled, which was on the New York Times bestseller list for 79 years or something like that. But his book, People of the Lie, he talks about his experience as a fairly secular psychiatrist, seeing things that had no normal explanation. And he eventually, as you know, because you read the book, eventually comes to see that there is no naturalistic, materialistic explanation. This is evil. This is something beyond our ability to medicate or reason past. Like this is evil. And I think there's just something really cool happening right now in the culture, Tucker, that because things have gotten this bad, and your average American says the world's going insane, what's going on? Like there's something healthy about that, because we're finally, to some extent, seeing things as they are and seeing that things weren't always okay. People have just taken the masks off now, and they can all, Biden and company can't pretend to be, Sam Nunn centrists or whatever. They've completely gone over the cliff. And so we're seeing, we're kind of seeing what happens. So there's something healthy going on, because I think a lot of people who maybe they were in the middle, or they're sort of waking up and seeing that we're in a war. And at the end of the day, yes, it's a spiritual war.
Well, I think it certainly feels that way, and I'm the last person you want to take theological analysis from.
But it's not theological. This is what I'm trying to say. It's like we always put it in that box. It's a theological. It's religious.
Right.
It's reality. It's just that we're now forced to go there to make sense of the larger.
And it's perceivable. I mean, I do think that the deeper truth of everything lies in your instincts. Like dogs, you can kind of smell it. My dogs know if you don't like dogs. Period. Like they know. They don't need to be told.
Right.
Because they can smell it. And we're all in possession of those instincts, and you can feel that something very odd is going. So let's get back. You just said that you were converted to Christianity by an Episcopalian, which has never happened.
Is that true?
To anybody?
Not really.
And Scott Peck was. So tell us your story. Where are you from? How'd you get from there to here?
Okay. In my previous book, Fish Out of Water, A Search for the Meaning of Life, I tell the story of my life up until my 25th birthday. My mom and dad came from Europe. My dad came from Greece. My mom came from Germany, Nazi Germany, and then East Germany, Communist Germany. They met in an English class in New York City and got married. And anybody knows that if you're raised by a Greek and a German, that means you will be raised Greek. So
I didn't know that.
Right. So I was raised in the Greek Orthodox Church and stuff. And for many immigrants, particularly Greeks, it's like your ethnicity becomes a kind of religion, a kind of a hobby. It's like it's your identity. So I was
that's
raised.
A cohesive group.
Oh, it's trust me. So in my previous book, Fish Out of Water, I talk about that whole thing. But what's interesting, and we don't have time, but at the end of the day, when your faith community there's a kind of a tribalism going on. They're like, we're here because we're Greeks. This is where the Greeks hang out. It's the Greek church. Very similar to the Bonhoeffer situation, where when the state or the ethnic identity gets kind of mushed together with the faith identity suffers.
Yes.
So what I mean by that is that growing up in the Greek Orthodox Church, just like people growing up in the Episcopal Church or this church or that church, you never really get the guts of the faith. It's kind of like you go through the motions, be a good kid, don't steal, get good grades, succeed, and keep moving. And so when you go to a place like Yale University, I don't need to tell you this.
From where did you
Suddenly, I grew up in Danbury, Connecticut, working class, European immigrant son, right? So this is the American dream. I get to go to an Ivy League school. So you go there, and you're not sure what you believe because nobody in the church growing up told you, oh, by the way, when you leave this little community, people are going to think you're insane for believing Jesus rose from the dead, or all that stuff that we talk about. They kind of didn't prepare and don't prepare people. So you go like a sheep among wolves. I get to Yale University. Political correctness had already completely taken over the campus. This is in the early and mid 80s.
What year did you get there?
Well, I graduated in 84. So can you imagine that critical race theory, all this garbage was there when I was there, right?
Yeah.
So if you're in the humanities, I want to be a writer. I want to study the classics and stuff. So I go there, and suddenly you're in this world of woke madness in the 80s, right? So because I didn't know what I believed, because I'd been raised to be a good boy and, be successful.
Were your parents not ideological?
Well, no. My parents, like anybody, they go to church. If you sit them down and say, what do you really believe? They'd be like, what do you mean? Because you're not, unless you're in some kind of a actively Christian world, like an evangelical world or serious Catholics, you just go with the flow. And you're not aware that we're in a war where the whole culture thinks that, believing somebody rose from the dead, that's insane, and
right.
Like, we'll pat you on the head, and if you have some exotic ethnicity, we'll give you a pass. If you're a person of color, we'll give you a pass. We don't want to embarrass you that you believe that stupid stuff. So when you get to a place like Yale, you're like me, I want to be a writer, and you pretty much get the memo. This is not how the successful people think. They think those people are crazy. So
right.
I sort of drifted. I graduated with awards for my writing and all this different stuff, and realized, okay, so now all my other friends are able to distract themselves from the big questions like what's the meaning of life by having really great jobs and working really hard. I I don't have a great job. I'm trying to be a writer, trying to write novels. And so I was thinking about this stuff and twisting in the wind. I lived in Boston for a while. I then moved back in with my parents in Danbury, Connecticut. And I always say, like, if you graduate college and you float and drift, it's like a mathematical theorem, like, or it's an axiom. You will move back in with your parents. So I moved back in with my parents.
So here your parents are immigrants in Danbury.
Working class immigrants who have the dream of sending a son to an Ivy League university. He comes back.
You literally go to Yale and then you show up on their doorstep.
And you show up at the doorstep like, hey. So my friends from Yale were, you know, their parents were like, oh, Eric's finding himself. And my parents would be like, Eric should find himself a job.
Yeah.
So it was a really painful year, but in that misery, my father wasn't going to let me hang around the house and pretend to write short stories, so I had to get a job. What can you do with a Yale English degree? Basically nothing. So I got a job as a proofreader at Union Carbide in Danbury, Connecticut.
What year?
This was 87.
So it was post-Bhopal.
Oh, I can't believe you're bringing that up.
Sorry.
We need to do 9 hours. Yes, it was so depressing. I mean, if you take somebody, I was the editor of the humor magazine at Yale. I write poetry. I write short stories. The idea of putting me in that corporate environment under the best circumstances is pure hell. After Bhopal, it was like, so I am living at home with my parents, completely lost, and going to a job proofreading chemical manuals 8 hours a day. Like, it was pure hell. And in the midst of this hell, you talk about Episcopalians, there was a graphic designer who I kind of connected with. He'd bring stuff for me to proofread. He was clearly a born-again Christian who attended an Episcopal church. And we would start talking, and when I realized, like, he really believes what the Bible says, I was like, yeah, I was trained at Yale to avoid people like you. Like, you're crazy. You're a violent insurrectionist. You'll try to kill Nancy Pelosi on January 6th. I know people like you, so I'm going to avoid you. But I was in enough pain living at home with my working class European immigrant parents who were like, what happened to you? We sent you to Yale. We worked menial jobs so you could go to Yale. What do you do?
I shouldn't be laughing. It's awful.
No. Listen, I didn't come here to talk about my book, Fish Out of Water, but it's the funniest book I've ever written because it's all true and it's insane. It's a true story of my life, right? So that year was hell, but looking back on it, it's hilarious. It's insane. So in my misery, I began ever so slightly to open up to the idea of the Christian faith as conceivable, possible. But not too much. Don't get too close with that weird stuff, right? Well, around my 25th birthday, long story short, too late, I had a completely miraculous conversion, Jesus dream, that literally overnight changed my life. And I think anything less, I couldn't have an intellectual conversion. I was too inoculated against it. So I had a serious miracle dream. I went to sleep not knowing whether you could know if God is real. And I woke up, game over, I'm in. I mean, it's insane.
What was the dream like?
It's too long to tell, but it is actually, it kind of has Jungian elements. I mean, it's the sort of thing that if anybody else, the reason I wrote a whole book called Fish Out of Water is because you have to track my life up to that point so that when I tell the story, the dream, it makes sense. Because anybody who doesn't know my life, the dream would just be like a non sequitur. But God in the dream weaves three parts of my life together, utterly disparate parts of my life, in a way that it so blew my mind that there was zero doubt that this is God. This is not like a crazy dream. I had too much pizza. This was a mind-blowing, life-changing experience. And I feel like I needed that because I was so, as I said, intellectually inoculated against believing this stuff.
Yes.
So it completely blew my mind, turned my world upside down. But it was so real and so incontestable that I just said, okay, Lord, whatever you have for me. And so since then, I've been allowing God to guide my career, which is way better than the way I'd been guiding it. Maybe I mentioned I was living with my mom and dad. So so God has taken me on a very
So where did you go? So this
journey.
happens to you, you're immediately convicted, convinced.
Yeah.
And so what do you do?
Well, this comes to the thesis of my new book, Is Atheism Dead? I immediately realized, and you'll get this, the parallels are hilarious, that I live in a world where I now know this is true, God is real, the Bible is real, but I live in a world where all of the elites, the cognoscenti, all my friends from Yale, know that people who believe that are insane. So we have a problem. We have some dissonance here, right?
For sure.
So, in a sense, I immediately knew that God's calling on my life is to be a voice in the midst of this, to try to quote John Milton, to justify the ways of God to man, to use my various gifts as a writer and a speaker to try to help people make sense of what I believe and see, in fact, that, you know, not only is it true, but there is overwhelming evidence for its truth. It's not just like a philosophy.
You mean the existence of God?
Well, I mean the existence of God, and not just God, but, you know, the God of the Bible and all that stuff. In other words, even if you don't want to believe it, you're living in a world that pretends like there is zero evidence for it. And I'm here to say there's outrageous evidence. It's just that if you live in the world in which we live, and God forbid you go to a place like Yale, you will never hear that evidence, and you will certainly not meet people who believe it, because they've been kind of,
Yes.
you know, they were canceled before people were getting canceled. It's just, they're just avoided, they're just ignored. We live in a secular culture. We can't have that.
You make a very compelling case. So, what did you do? Like, what was your first job?
Okay, yeah. So to be more practical, so I had this moment actually where I remember. I mean, this is like, it is comedy, and it's in the book. I was at Union Carbide. I now know Jesus is real. All this stuff is real. What am I going to do now? And so I remember praying.
Did you tell your parents, by the way?
Oh yeah. I mean, you can imagine. You know, they were not like. I mean, you know, when you're young, you say stupid things, and I remember saying to my father that, you know, I've really become a Christian, right? And so he's looking at me like, what were you before? Like, you were an altar boy? Like, we drove to church literally every Sunday, so like, what are you talking about?
And your services are long in the Greek Orthodox Church,
yeah,
right?
Too long. And I, you know, I didn't know how to put it into words, because I wanted to say to him, I've been born again. I have a relationship with Jesus. I didn't have that before. Before, I was not a Muslim, I was not an atheist, I was not a Buddhist, I was not a Jew. Oh, okay, I guess I'm a Christian. I was not a Christian. I was a Gentile who didn't really know what I believed, or whether you could even know what you believe. I'd been trained, you know, at one of the finest universities in the land to question authority to the point of not believing there is such a thing as truth and whatever, you know. And so suddenly I have this epiphany. But when you try to explain it to your working class European immigrant parents, they look at you like, what? Like, is this a phase? Are you crazy? Are you rejecting the Greek church now? What are you saying? You're going to become Episcopalian? What, you know, it was complete madness. So, practically speaking,
I get it.
I remember one day just praying and saying, okay, Lord, like, if you were able to reach me in this horrible environment of, as being a proofreader at Union Carbide in Danbury, Connecticut, post-Bhopal, I'm going to just figure out that you've got a plan. So I will not leave. This is really crazy. I said, I will not leave this horrible job unless you move me out. This was like a real faith prayer. I said, maybe you have a reason. I mean, if my friend Ed Tuttle, the graphic designer, was here and reached me, maybe there's somebody here you want me to tell about you. Like, I don't know. I'm not leaving this job until you move me out. Literally, like 3 or 4 months later, I remember thinking, okay, maybe I'm going to be here for a while. The next day, I got laid off totally out of the blue. And the same day that I was laid off, I had an appointment with some folks down in Westport, Connecticut, to talk about some nickel and dime writing stuff, like on the side, a couple $100 or whatever. I show up. They hand me half of my annual salary from Union Carbide in 2 writing projects, which I literally would have done for free. They were like these glorious children's book adaptations. I was like, this is really cool. So, and then a couple of days later, they handed me a 3rd project. So it was like I was laid off, like without even knowing that was possible, and then handed a dream job working for a company called Rabbit Ears Productions, which created videos for kids, really super high quality. They won Grammy Awards for Best Children's Recording and stuff. So I got put into this place of like literary heaven mixed with Hollywood, because we were producing videos and working with, you know, Meryl Streep and Jack Nicholson doing these recordings and everything like that. So it launched me into that world. So I've by now written 30 children's books. Nobody even
30?
knows. 30 children's books. And I have, I work for VeggieTales. Some people know that. Some people are like, oh, now we'll listen to him. You work for VeggieTales? So yes, I work for VeggieTales. And so I had a very crazy career. I ended up working for Chuck Colson, who was a hero of mine.
Man.
I loved him like crazy.
At
So
Prison Fellowship.
I worked for him. And so I had all this kind of stuff going on, and it really wasn't until the last 20 years that I have, you know, found my métier writing a book. I've written 13, you know, non-children's books by now. And I have a radio show and a TV show and all this different stuff. But all these years, I mean, as crazy as it all sounds, I have known that at the center of it is God's calling on my life to be a voice for faith and common sense. And, you know, once I came to faith, I became a political conservative because I thought, you know, all my friends at Yale, maybe they were wrong about that too. So, so practically speaking, I had a very difficult career in a sense, trying to make a living, right? But I did all these different things, and it was only when the Bonhoeffer book came out, like 12 years ago, that things kind of exploded for me.
What a wonderful book that is.
But well, thank you. But the funny thing is, Tucker, is like, who would have dreamt? I shouldn't say that. I would have dreamt when I was writing it, because when I was writing it, I could sort of smell that what I was writing about, I could feel like this is on the horizon in America. Like, it's not the kind of thing you want to think when you're writing a book like this.
And I should have said this. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a childhood hero of mine, and I think probably of some of our viewers, but maybe not all. So can you just give us the two-sentence explanation?
He was a German pastor who got involved in the plot to kill Hitler. I mean, the story is so amazing. We're actually making a, you know, $25 million feature film. It's like one of these stories from history that it is so amazing that you cannot help but be moved and changed by it. And when I was writing the book, I didn't quite know this. I thought, he's a hero, I'm going to write this story, but little did I know that it would resonate so powerfully with so many people. Because I think, you know, to get back to what we were saying before, as you go through life, you're thinking, what's the meaning of life? What's going on? And you look at a story like this, you think of a man of integrity who's a serious Christian who, while the Nazis are taking over, he's one of the lone voices in the church saying to the church, we have to oppose this now. And everybody in the church saying, take it easy, young man, don't be a hothead. Well, you know, he'll just be a one-term Führer. We got this, no problem. Well, Bonhoeffer knew that at the heart of National Socialist doctrine were these atheistic, Marxist, ironically, not Bolshevik, but these atheistic ideas that had zero respect for humanity, for God. It was all about power. And he was enough of a serious Christian that he could intuit this before anybody else. So he was kind of like a prophet. And he was saying, you don't understand. What Hitler and these folks believe, if you do not believe that we're created in the image of God, if you do not believe that every human being is sacred, if you don't believe any of this stuff, what's to stop you from murdering millions of your political enemies? Nothing. So Bonhoeffer was trying to wake up the church to what is happening. And the church, to some extent similar to today, said, you know, we don't want to get political. We just want to have our nice church services. So if we need to put a swastika flag outside the building, we just want people to leave us alone. So today, you know, whether it's a rainbow flag or a BLM flag, just tell us what we need to do so people won't burn us down and think of us as trouble. That's exactly what happened to the mainline church in Germany.
Of course.
And Bonhoeffer said, not only can I go along with this, I must do something about this, because he knew what was going to happen to the Jews. So he got involved ultimately in the plot to kill Hitler and his top lieutenants, and for that he was ultimately hanged by the Nazis.
In the very final days.
3 weeks before the end of the war, 3 weeks before Hitler killed himself, Bonhoeffer was hanged by the Nazis at age 39, and just one of the most brilliant theologians who ever lived. But here's the key: he wasn't just a theologian; he was a theologian who had a personal relationship with the Jesus of the Bible. So this wasn't just head knowledge. He knew that it's about reality. Is this real? And if this is real, I need to be willing to stake my life on it. People have died for freedom, for truth, for whatever. So he lived out his faith. And so when people come across that book and read the story, you can't help but be inspired by someone who lived like that, because guess what? When you read it, you realize, oh yeah, by the way, I'm supposed to live like that
That's
too.
right.
And by the way, now I want to, because I've been so inspired. So it's kind of, that's the beauty. People think, oh, if only he had lived. And I think, no, this was God's plan, you know, and that he has inspired a lot
What
of people.
serious, his book Life Together, the letters and papers, the letter mostly to his sister.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very serious, joyful, humane, but very serious person who grasped the seriousness of the moment in which he was living. I mean, that's
Well, but to me, what makes it really powerful is that his is one of the greatest geniuses. I mean, he was a super genius, but he also had the faith of a child, and that's, usually you get one or the other. You know, he had the faith of a child, and he understood that I need to live this out. This is not about me being a brilliant theologian. If I can't translate these highfalutin ideas down to the level that the person in the pew can understand, then what am I doing? I'm trying to impress my colleagues. So he's such an amazing figure because he lived it out. And I think part of what I've done, I've written 3 major biographies, and then I've written shorter biographies, a book called
What was
7
the
Men
third?
and 7 Women. Well, I wrote a book on William Wilberforce.
Oh, I knew that. I haven't read
Amazing
it.
Grace, the man who led the battle for the abolition of the slave trade. And so these are people that, because of their faith, they were willing to risk everything, because they said, God's got my back. If this is true, I don't need to worry about what's going to happen to my career.
Right.
William Wilberforce would have been Prime Minister of England if he had not said, I think that this is immoral, that we are making, our economy is resting on a slave trade. And as a Christian, he was one of those, he wasn't just a Church of England, churchgoer. He had this conversion experience. And so he said, I need to live my career. I need to use my career and use my gifts and use my position to do what God wants me to do. So he led the abolition of the slave trade. That's his signal achievement. But he did a host of other things, really, again, one of those lives. So I wrote that book first, and that's when people said, who are you going to write about next? And I thought, well, if I have to write another biography, I'll write one about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but I'll never write another one after that. And then I was persuaded to write the Luther book. But I'm done. No more biographies. No more major biographies.
Well, it's a heavy lift. I mean, that's...
It is.
your Luther biography is a serious book. It's a book of scholarship, and it's... I was reading it and I was thinking, this is not a weekend project.
No, but it was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation,
right.
And I thought, you know what it is? Once I got into the Luther story, I understood how important he was. I hadn't really grasped what a seminal figure he was, that what he saw and was willing to stand for ultimately changed everything. He didn't know that. It's just kind of like your life or my life or anybody's life. You don't know, if you do what is right and true, you don't know where it's going to lead. You just know that today I need to stand for truth. And,
Talk about giving the finger to the man. Martin Luther gave the finger to the man.
But I'll tell you what, Tucker, I was thinking about this recently, that Luther, and you know this if you read the book, he didn't start out wanting to do that.
I know.
He started out wanting to help them.
Of course, to reform this indulgence thing is insane.
Okay,
he kept saying that. Yeah.
So what happened to him, and I realize this because something similar has happened to me, and maybe to you to some extent, you try to play nice and you try to help people in a civil way see things. But if the response is they punch you in the face, you go away and you think, okay, maybe I need to speak a little bit more loudly or speak a little bit more boldly because they didn't get the message. And so in a sense, the absurd opposition, you saw this with Trump. It's like when people respond so outrageously, you're forced to respond ever so slightly more outrageously. There's a beautiful article by a brilliant scholar named Peter Wood in American Greatness, where he talks about this very thing. He wrote a book on civility in 2007. called "The Bee in the Mouth," and you know how we need to whatever. But he really was echoing. I interviewed him recently, where I have felt it's like, but as people are increasingly less civil or unable to have a conversation, you more and more realize I have to paint in bold lines. I mean, you know the famous Flannery O'Connor quote, right? That she wanted to. Why did she write these crazy short stories? She kind of felt like she needed to create really bold characters and bold stories to wake up people who just, you know, she didn't want them just to read a nice story in the waiting room at the dentist office. She wanted to kind of like speak to them about God. And so it's
and
a funny...
it worked.
And it worked.
I think of Flannery O'Connor at least once a week. She would have been a good woman if someone had held a gun to her head every day of her life. The single greatest line
can I tell you...
in any short story ever written.
Listen, she is... Flannery O'Connor, because I've written so much humor over the years, there is nobody funnier. There are some things in her short stories that are the funniest things I have ever
so dark
read, and she was a serious Christian with tremendous literary gifts. But so, to get back to Luther, I just think that sometimes you realize they're not listening. I need to scream. I need to use hand gestures. I need to, and I think we're living in a time like that. And Peter Wood's article and his new book titled "Wrath" gets at this, where we're living in strange times. Some people don't want to hear about it. They just want to go on as things were before. But the problem is you can't.
No.
You're not being allowed to. So I really think that many people are waking up to that. It's a good thing, in a sense, that's happening. When madness is unleashed, enough people look around and go, this is crazy. They're telling me that if I don't believe a rooster can lay an egg, I'm a bigot. When did that happen? I mean, I remember, where was I? I was here in Florida listening to Rick DeSantis give a speech, and he said something about, in Florida, you know, I'm going to make sure that high school girls only compete in athletic competitions against high school girls. And everybody, including me and my wife, are cheering. And I thought, what the heck are we cheering? This is like, he just said 1 + 1 = 2. But that's how crazy things are.
The bar has moved, I would say, for reasonable behavior. So is atheism dead? I think everything that you have talked about sort of leads up to that question organically. You happen to have written a book with that title. So let me just ask the question posed by the title. Is it dead?
Yes. Actually, the reason I gave the book that title, I didn't want to write about atheism, but in 1966, there was the famous Time magazine cover article, Is God Dead? And that's when the ideas of the intelligentsia, of the academy, you know, Darwin, 1859, Freud, Margaret Mead, all these ideas, you know, exist up here. And then at some point, and I say roughly 1966, they trickle down, and Time magazine puts this grotesque idea, is God dead, in the middle of America's living rooms.
Right.
Okay? Is God dead?
At the center of middle-brow culture.
Okay?
Right.
And so, in a sense, the evidence against God from science and everything reaches a high watermark in roughly 1966. So this question is asked. And my thesis in writing the book is that the question was settled by the cognoscenti in 1966. Pretty much, God is dead. We live in a secular world, and we need to get on with it. And they never really continued to look at the evidence, or they kind of had settled that. So we've been living in a secular culture, you know, again, roughly since then, which means that which means that we don't really take seriously the idea of God, that has been on the wane. And everything that follows, if you push God out of the equation, getting back to the Solzhenitsyn quote, bad stuff follows. What follows? If people don't believe in God and in virtue and in self-government and answering to a higher authority, I don't steal because God doesn't want me to steal, things begin to break down, and the state inevitably has to take more and more power. We become less and less free. These are the inevitable fruits. It's not even like anybody planned this. But the point is, as you go down through the decades, it gets worse and worse and worse until we find ourselves here. So the reason I wrote the book, it really had to do with, I didn't want to write about atheism or write about these ideas, but I met two people from completely different disciplines and you know, some people would say, oh, well, it was serendipitous. I clearly believe, in retrospect, it was God's hand. But I happened to meet two people who gave me, in effect, evidence for God that was so astonishing from two totally different disciplines that I thought, like, I've been into this whole thing of looking at science and biblical archaeology for decades, but these two pieces are so dramatic, I think I need to write a book because no one knows either of these two figures or has heard about this stuff. And I thought, and I'll mix in all this other stuff that I've read about over the years. And so I thought, the evidence from science has become insane. Like, it's so overwhelming that there's a creator, the evidence from science, that I said the real question you'd have to ask at this point is atheism dead? Because a rational person can be an agnostic, can say, I hate the Bible. You could say whatever you want, but I don't think, given what we now know from science in the last, let's say, 50 years, since we stopped asking the question, the evidence has piled up. I don't think we can believe that there is no God and that everything, life, this glorious planet, the universe, that these things emerged randomly. In other words, I think we know too much from science now that we didn't know in the 50s and 60s, that there is no other conclusion but that there was an infinite, intelligent creator behind this. So when I came upon this information, I said, the craziest part of this information is that nobody knows this. Nobody's talking about this. We live in a world that, swallowed the Kool-Aid in 1966. God and all that stuff is pretty much passé, so we're not going to look at that evidence. And so I said, how ironic it is that the evidence for God from the world of science has been coming in more and more dramatically in the last 5 decades, and nobody's talking about it. So I said, I need to write about that. Then I need to write about biblical archaeology, because similarly, the more we dig in the Middle East, the more we find insane evidence for the historicity of the Bible. This is not just a book of folktales from, an ancient time. Like, it just, the evidence has piled up and up and up. So I said, I need to write a book, in a sense, putting this information out there. And I will just say, I mean, I'm a popularizer, I'm not an academic, but the evidence is so overwhelming that the real headline is, why doesn't everybody know this? Like, because if it's as overwhelming as I say, you think, well, everybody would know that. And I would say, well, yes, we live in such a secular world that the people who run the newspapers and all this stuff, they don't speak that language, so they either simply ignore it, or maybe they're ideologically opposed to it and they ignore it intentionally. But we've lived in a world where all of this information and evidence has basically been ignored. And so we all have been gaslit into thinking that it's rational to think there is no God. But it's very similar to where we are now in the culture, right? Like, if you're watching the wrong TV station, you live in an alternative reality. And so those of us who, discover things, we just need to shout louder, because there are people that are hungry.
I mean, I'm trying to remember whether it was C.S. Lewis or Frederick Buechner, very different, but both theologians of a sort, who said, if God himself appeared, like, in the sky over a football game, and said, I'm here, would that actually change the way that we live?
If he said football game, it had to be Buechner.
Right,
that's right. But the fact of the matter is that, doesn't that get right back to Jesus is telling the parable? He's saying that if Moses appeared, no, what does he say? I mean, I guess the point is, the question has always been the same. Human beings, given who we are, some people, and again, the reason I wrote Is Atheism Dead is not so you can say to your atheist friend, like, here, read this, and it'll
right.
There are people that I've had conversations with, brilliant people whose names you would know, and I will tell them a story of a miracle so detailed and incontrovertible that logic would dictate that their response would be, wow, it sounds like God is real. Maybe I don't like that idea, but the logic dictates that I look at the evidence. But their responses have, in some cases, been exactly the opposite. And you realize, to get back to your first question, this is a spiritual issue. In other words, you can't argue somebody via logic into the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that there aren't rational explanations. This is, when we're talking science, we're talking biblical archaeology, we're talking We could talk about atheist nation states. Hey, how's that going for their citizens? Is atheism working for them? How does it work when people believe in God? Does that, like, what? Let's just talk about what works. Yeah. The point is that when you have these conversations, some people will hear it and go like, "Wow, that's exciting! I never heard that before. I want to know more." Other people go, "It makes me uncomfortable. What are you having for lunch?" They don't want to talk about it. But I thought I at least owe the people who are on the fence these arguments. And again, the argument from science, I don't mean to be so abstract. I mean, look, Christopher Hitchens, the most famous atheist of recent decades, was once asked in the back of a limo, somebody shoved a camera in his face, said, "Hey, you've debated all these people. What are the strongest arguments on the God side now that you've heard all the arguments?" And in a rare moment of candor, because he could be very nasty and intellectually dishonest, I'm sorry to say, he said, "Oh, without any question, the fine-tuned argument." And that's the scientific argument that the more we discover from science, right, the idea that, if the Earth were the tiniest bit bigger or the tiniest bit smaller, either way, no life, no atmosphere. And you think, how come I didn't hear that in school? Because that's science. That's not religious, right? That's just science. That kind of a metric or parameter, everywhere we look in science, we find that level of fine-tuning, right? So even Christopher Hitchens was troubled by this, and he admitted it. But when I speak in, huge churches and stuff...
That's just the... I knew Christopher well and really loved him.
Yeah. No, I have friends that loved him.
Yeah,
but when it came to that stuff,
for sure,
he was...
But that's the least... in my view, I mean, the real question is, how do you explain instinct? And Darwin doesn't even attempt it, nor does science. So you're born knowing certain things. This is true of animals as well. And, why is that?
Actually, there's a new book on the animal stuff.
Yes.
It is next level insane. The stuff that is programmed into ants and things and migration and stuff.
Exactly.
There is zero possibility that these behaviors evolve.
Well, but
zero.
They don't even attempt to look. And I think there are things about Darwinism that are clearly. He was a great observer of nature, and some of it's clearly true. But as a sort of theory of everything, if you can't explain instinct, then you're not even approaching the truth.
But you're super bright. Most people don't go there. We could talk about this another time.
Sorry.
No. But what I'm just trying to say is that gets complicated on some level.
Yeah, I know.
It's another conversation.
I know.
But the fine-tuned universe, I'm just saying, if you just want to know, did this just get here, or was there some designer behind this universe? The evidence from science, which is literally why I wrote the book, I said it has piled up to a level where it is open and shut, ladies and gentlemen. This is not even a discussion. I'm being polite, even pretending that it's kind of like saying, was that a hologram of Tucker, or was it real, Eric? Let's discuss this. If I entertain the question, I'm already playing with your head. It's right. No, I was in the room. He was like, why are we having this stupid conversation? The evidence from science has piled up so ridiculously that if you dare to read just what's in my book, I mean, this is a popular level book, but I'm saying most people never come across this evidence. And I think that's how you know we're living in a crazy world, because this is science. This is not some weird philosophy or something. This is what science says. So the fine-tuned argument, there's stuff that we've been able to discover with science recently. You know what I'm saying? 30 years ago, we didn't know this. That most scientists, when they look at it, they go, well, that's really weird. If this were, I mean, there are four, when they talk about the Big Bang, right, they say that within a millionth of a second after the Big Bang, 13.8 billion years ago, within a millionth of a second, the four constants, the gravitational constant, the electromagnetic constant, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force, these four fundamental forces were set in stone less than a millionth of a second after the Big Bang. And if any one of those four constants were ever so slightly different, I mean, by 0.000001, right? No universe. Forget about life and planet Earth. No universe. There would be no planets, no stars, nothing. This is what science is able to tell us now. And that's just one level. But everywhere you look in science, we now have the ability to see things that we couldn't see 50 years ago. So when Time magazine writes, "Is God dead?" you can understand why they would think that. But since then, the evidence has piled up amazingly more and more and more and more. And then, obviously, the question is, why don't we know it? Because we've moved on. And I'll bet you didn't know this. Unless you read my book, I'll bet you didn't know this. I was looking at, what do different atheists say? And I was very flippant, as you can tell. Actually, no. I was very disappointed in the ability of folks like Hitchens and Dawkins to be intellectually honest about what they were discovering. They seem to have an animus against people of faith or about faith, and so they just kind of like attacked religion.
Well, there's a shallowness at the heart of their critique. I would say, and with someone who has great respect for Hitchens.
But that's the point.
Yeah.
And right. So I said, but what about the people whose atheism I respect? What about Jean-Paul Sartre? Yep. What about Albert Camus? Those two men were convinced that we're in a world without God, we're alone in the universe, but they weren't happy about it. They saw that if this is true, it is infinitely bleak.
Right.
And so they tried to figure out, how do we create an ethical system? How do we live as human beings?
No, that's right.
Okay, so...
Only the French are that deep. We're not capable,
okay,
we're not capable of public conversations like that.
I'll bet you don't know the punchline of this, because I myself, when I wrote the book, didn't know this. And I still can't believe it. Camus in 1960 and Sartre in 1980, both of them right before their deaths, came to believe in God. And I don't mean just in God, but probably... And Sartre is more documented. That's the... I think either it was National Review or something, like literally 1980 wrote about this, but he was... in any event, both of these atheist, intellectual, philosophical giants who had the guts to not be shallow and to look into bleakness of the abyss of a world without God, both of them, independent of each other, came to faith, and it seems Christian faith.
That does not surprise me about Camus, who was, I think, the better man at all, but I'm shocked, and I thought I would have known that.
But my point is, no one knows this. So when I discovered it, I thought, this can't be true. I have to go back and I realized the world is so crazy that when the two atheist giants of the 20th century come to Christian faith, no one knows about it. No one ever talks about it. I mean, nobody ever mentions it as a footnote when they're teaching undergraduates, we're going to read No Exit this week. Oh, and by the way, there's no by the way. Almost no one knows this. So when I came upon it, I thought, what does that say about the atheistic worldview? That the two people who took it most seriously and looked at it as unyieldingly as they did, both of them saw it can't be right, it can't be true, and at the end of their lives come to faith, and nobody knows about it.
So can I just ask you, I mean, you have the First World War, probably the worst thing that ever, in my view, most pointless thing that ever happened in world history, destroyed European civilization. After that, you start getting like real atheism as a movement. Before that, was there ever any period in world history that we know about in which a large number of people professed atheism?
Well, no, because it wasn't culturally possible.
Because it's so stupid.
Well, look,
like it wouldn't even occur to people.
But who? I think literally the other day I finally read who it was who said some ideas are so stupid it takes an intellectual to believe in them.
Yeah.
I literally always forget who it was.
Paul Johnson said that, I think.
I believe it was Soupy Sales. I think you're wrong. But the point is that the idea of atheism is on many, many levels preposterous and laughable.
Of course.
But you have figures through history who believed it and talked about it. But the way information works and the way the media works and the way the culture works, it takes a number of things to make it fashionable. And it wasn't possible really for that to happen. I mean, look, this had happened. I learned this from Peter Hitchens, that it was after the First War that the twin authorities of church and state had been so discredited that the elites in Europe turned away from God and whatever. But that didn't happen in America really till the 60s and 70s. In other words, we were still enough of a Bible-believing country that it took Vietnam and Watergate for those things to come into middle American life.
Clearly, I would argue maybe it began a little earlier in the Second World War, but whatever. But you're right.
Well, I mean, yeah, you could trace it back infinitely.
Between
but I'm saying
1919 and 1941,
yeah,
this was a very religious country for sure.
Well, right, and listen, it still is. But the point is that the intellectual elites, the folks that I went to Yale with, and the folks that you have been rubbing shoulders with, they live in a world that is secular, and that culture, that atheistic secular culture, it's taken decades and decades to trickle down. It took till 1966 till Henry Luce could throw it in the middle of America and say, "Is God dead?" I mean, nobody would have dreamt, nobody would have dared to ask a question not just that preposterous, but that like offensive to most Americans. Is God dead? What? What does that even mean? Why are you asking that?
People were stunned by it.
Why are you asking that? But what I'm saying is that it's really since then that these ideas have found their way more and more into American life and made possible the madness of a drift toward atheistic Marxism in America, where we don't have the cultural confidence to say this is a great country, and even though we've made mistakes, people have died so that we could be free, and we've been a force for good, and if we get something wrong, we want to get it right, and we want to be a beacon of liberty. How many decades does it take before the people in D.C. and elsewhere don't have the cultural confidence to say, yeah, America is a great nation? I mean, my parents, when they were on the boat in the mid-50s, passing the Statue of Liberty, leaving their war-torn countries, both of them, as many people did, got up at 4:45 a.m. to come to the top of the ship to see the Statue of Liberty and to get choked up because they had not been educated to mock the idea of American liberty, to mock the idea of the founders that risked their lives for this thing called freedom. They knew the hell of a world where there was no freedom, and they had, I was saying earlier, it's like the faith of a child. They didn't know enough to know that, the elites would sneer at your patriotism. Right. They didn't sneer, and they didn't raise me to sneer at it, because when you hear their stories of suffering in World War II, they both went through hell and hunger. To come to the golden land of America, where your kids might be able to go to an Ivy League school and you may be able to buy a house and stuff. And I think many Americans are still there. They understand that whatever is going on, this is the greatest nation in the history of the world. And if we don't understand that we are in a war where the forces of communism, animated, I would argue, by spiritual forces, they want to destroy the last best hope of Earth. They know there's no America waiting in the wings. There are demons waiting in the wings. And so we're in a battle, and I think a lot of people have gotten a lot of encouragement from you and your willingness to talk about the stuff that other people aren't willing to talk about. But if we don't understand that every one of us has a voice, and if we don't do everything we can right now, 5 years from now, you won't have a voice.
I agree with
you
that.
Won't, whatever money you have that you can use to give to organizations fighting this now, you won't even have that money. That'll be taken away from you. So you're in a war, and you need to fight now. And I think that there are enough Americans who get that and who understand that this is a spiritual battle. This is God versus the devil, freedom versus the communist Chinese butchering Uyghur Muslims for their organs. I mean, it's that nasty. It's the divisions are that clear. That's where we are. And so, suddenly talking about whether God is real is part of the conversation, because it's at the heart of all these questions.
It is at the very heart, and I so appreciate your commitment to bringing the conversation back to the things that actually matter. Like, if you can't even answer what happens when you die, maybe you're not a very serious person. You know what I mean?
But actually, lately I've been thinking about this. Like, I'm thinking, hey, folks, like, don't you understand that when all is said and done, what are the questions every human being has? What's the meaning of life? Where did I come from? Is God real? If he is, can I know him?
Where am I going?
Where am I going? These are the most basic questions. And what you're being told is, keep moving. Don't
Just
ask
ignore
those
the basics.
questions.
Don't think about
Get
stuff.
a good job. I mean, I always say that when I was at Yale, it had gotten to a place where the message was clear. Everybody got the memo. We don't ask the big questions here.
Yeah.
Because we've sort of answered them already, and the answers are so depressing, we will lose our endowment and no one will give any more. So we will not address that. We will just tell you, get a good job, work really hard, and do not think about these questions. And in a few decades, it'll all be over. And by the way, on the weekends, there's like alcohol and sports. Whatever you do not think about these questions because the answers are so bleak and sick, you'll want to commit suicide. So have a good time, and we'll see you at the reunion. That's pretty much the memo. And as I said, because I didn't get a good job, because I want to be a writer, I had time to think about these things, and only by God's grace was I led to the answer. But I know that there are people still working hard to avoid these questions because they don't want to become like Tucker or Eric. They don't want to, they want to keep a good thing going. Tell me where do I...
If you'd gone to Citibank, America would have been robbed of this conversation and so much of what you've done ever since. Really quick, we're over an hour. But it's been bugging me the whole conversation. I just have to ask, did your parents live to see you fulfill their hopes, as of course you have?
When I get in the car to go to the airport, I'm going to call my mom and dad.
Oh,
and I'm going to
wonderful.
tell them that I was hanging out with Tucker and we talked about all these different things. My parents, my dad's 94, my mom's 87.
Oh.
It is the privilege of my life to be able to see them. I'll see them this weekend in Connecticut. I love them to death. And they have no idea. And I mentioned earlier my book, Fish Out of Water. My father, when I was writing the book, I'd call him up and ask him, can you tell me about that? I was getting details from my childhood and stuff. And he was worried. I find this hilarious. He was worried, like, you're not going to write about that, are you, Eric? You're not going to write about that. And I was like, Dad, like, you're 94. You're not going to lose your job because there's some anecdote in here. And by the way, you inadvertently, this is me and my father, you are the hero of this story. Like, I didn't write it but his picture's on the cover of the book. And it's a picture that my mother took. They were on a date at the Statue of Liberty in 1957. And she took a picture. It's a beautiful picture. It's the whole thing's crazy. But I say in the book, ultimately, that just by raising me and loving me, my parents gave me something which is an appreciation for America and liberty and right and wrong, that most Americans, because we've been so blessed in America, we've lost sight of how rare and magnificent American freedom is. And so my parents, by sacrificing and loving me and my brother, they end up being the heroes of this book. And it's so clear when you read it, but they, they're too humble to get that. But my dad and my mom, leaving war-torn Europe, they were just in a unique position to raise my brother and me to understand, like, this is not normal. This is a gift. This country and the opportunities in this country are an outrageous gift. You don't deserve it. Take advantage of it. And then use it, by the way, to bless those who don't have it. And we in America, when America is thriving, we have the ability to help those in the world, to give hope to the Uyghur Muslims.
I agree.
You remember when Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, I always say the demons trembled, because that was a prophetic statement made by President of the United States that gave hope to those in the Soviet gulag, that there is someone out there who believes in freedom, who is willing to risk something, that there's a nation so great that they're willing to risk their blood and treasure for folks like us, in Soviet prisons. And so these questions, it's the same thing over and over again. And if I can do my part to remind people of these things, I feel really honored, and I'm really thrilled to be here talking to you. Really enjoy you, and I'm very proud of you.
Eric from Texas, thank you. Tucker Carlson today is the name of the show. New episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on Fox Nation. Needless to say, we'll see you every weeknight, 8 p.m. on the Fox News Channel.